Chapter 15, The Cup of Life. Chinese New Year was approaching. Many people would leave the city to go to seaside resorts or other holiday places for the week. Those who stayed in the city would burn old things all day, and the many fires would add to the smoke, dust, and darkness of the cold February air. Fireworks and firecrackers would pop all day and late into the night. The pressure at school was mounting as teachers expected projects and papers to be completed before the break. "I'm toast," groaned Emily as she flopped into a library chair. "How are we supposed to do all this work?" "Organizational skills and discipline," said Raj, mimicking Mr. Helmsby and his time management workshop. "I feel much better organized after his talk." Solomon rolled his eyes. "I am organized," Emily said, "and I'm still barely keeping up. I feel like there's never enough time." "It's like this every year," said Mei Ling. "Aren't you guys feeling the stress?" Emily was starting to worry that there was something wrong with her. "I'm feeling it," said Solomon. He was fidgeting with his metallic watch strap, trying to tighten it. "I guess it's a bit like those juggling balls, though. You just keep moving and somehow everything stays in the air. What other choice do we have?" Raj looked at Emily. "It is getting more intense around here," he said softly. "Don't worry. You're not crazy, Emily." She looked back at him, grateful for the kindness. "Okay, let's get started," said Solomon. He settled into his chair. "I wonder what today's secret will be." "I hope it's something that eases the pressure," said Emily. "I'm exhausted," Mei Ling said. "I need the break." They sat quietly for a few minutes, trying to fully relax, until Mei Ling's voice brought them into silent contemplation. Her calm voice was familiar to them now, and it helped them focus and concentrate their attention. When they opened their eyes, they were standing in a huge, empty room. The floor was solid wood beneath their feet. The walls were made of glass, curving upwards like a fishbowl. The only object in the room was a pedestal, positioned in the center with an ornate chalice perched on top. It seemed out of place in the empty room, but it was obviously their intended destination. "There are no doors," said Raj, spinning in a circle to survey the room. Emily began walking toward the pedestal, only to discover that each step took her further away from it. "Oh," Mei Ling muttered. She was trying to follow Emily to the pedestal, but she remained at a standstill. "Oh, this is creepy," whispered Emily. "What's happening?" Solomon watched as the girls attempted without success to get traction. He could see their legs moving, but Mei Ling remained in the same place, and Emily was moving backwards. "Stop!" he yelled. Both girls stopped moving. "It's an illusion," he said, as he attempted to walk to the center of the room, and had the same disorienting experience of moving without getting anywhere. "It's obvious we're supposed to get to that cup," said Emily, "but how? And why?" Raj asked. The chalice was close enough for them to see that it was made of 4 different metals, forming stripes of equal width. The top quarter of the goblet was a sparkling golden color. The next section was silver, slightly tarnished, followed by a layer of orange metal, maybe copper. The base was made of a darker metal like iron. Tick-tock, tick-tock. A steady ticking sound was suddenly audible, but the source of the sound was not visible. "Okay, we get it. There's a time pressure for this task," snapped Raj. Raj dropped to the floor and started slowly sliding his body forward, pushing against the floor for leverage. He was making progress. Solomon tried to run to the pedestal, but his feet slipped out from under him. He moaned as his back hit the floor. Mei Ling looked down at the floor and noticed a thin film of sand gathering at her feet. "Solomon, is there sand where you are?" she asked. He looked down at his clothes and saw that they were covered with sand. "Yeah, that's what I slipped on. What's happening?" "The sand is coming from a hole in the ceiling," Raj said, pointing upwards. The sprinkling intensified until the sand was falling like heavy rain. Solomon saw that his feet were disappearing under a pile of sand that was spreading quickly over the floor. He looked up at the hole in the ceiling and around at the glass walls. The sand cascaded over the cup, which was shielded by an invisible barrier that prevented it from filling. The sand spread quickly across the room as it gushed over the cup, pushed by the force of the drop and its sheer volume. "We're in an hourglass," Solomon yelled over the sound of the clock and the falling sand. "Ah, so this is all about time," said Raj. "Get it? Time is an illusion. It's the unseen force we move against. This is the cup of life from the book, remember?" Tick, tock, tick, tock. The steady beat of the clock was speeding up, sounding a mantra of hurry, hurry. Their movement was further impeded by the deep sand accumulating around them. Slipping and sliding, Solomon tried to propel himself forward. "You look like you're swimming," Emily laughed at Solomon until she tried to take a step and fell to her knees. Mei Ling started to panic. "We'll be buried if the sand keeps falling," she said, her voice shaking. While the others continued to struggle, Raj succeeded in inching slowly to the center of the room. "Hey, it's wet here," he yelled from beside the pedestal. His fingers were touching the sand that had fallen across the base of the chalice. Copying Raj, Emily lowered herself to the floor and moved deliberately, pushing her way to the pedestal. She reached her hand out to touch the cup and was jolted backwards onto a pile of sand. "Emily, are you okay?" Mei Ling was approaching the pedestal, copying Emily's movements. Both Mei Ling and Emily were sweating and panting with fatigue. Emily shook her head in confusion and returned to the cup more tentatively this time. As she reached out her fingers to touch it, an energy field surrounded the cup, repelled her approach, and she recoiled. "Now what?" she asked. "If we can't touch it, how can we do anything?" Mei Ling looked around the room, hoping to see evidence of a door, but the glass remained smooth and unbroken, trapping them in sand. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound of the clock was loud and relentless, urging them toward an unclear deadline. The sand was now piling around them in dunes. "Some kind of liquid is draining from the cup," said Raj, who had been examining it closely. Mei Ling approached cautiously. When she was close enough, she climbed onto a pile of sand to look inside the cup. An amber-colored liquid was seeping from the bottom of the cup, draining down through the stem. A line around the inside of the rim indicated where the liquid had been before draining out. Solomon had now reached the pedestal. "There's no sign of a crack anywhere," he said. Raj reached out to touch the stem of the cup, but Solomon pushed his hand out of the way. "Don't, Raj, there's some kind of electric field surrounding it." Raj glared at Solomon, more annoyed by the intervention than thankful to be saved from the shock. He looked around the room at the mass of sand beginning to drift in piles. "We have to do something with this liquid," said Raj, his voice muted under a steady shower of sand. "But what?" Solomon's voice was unusually shrill. He was starting to panic as he struggled to stay above the sand, accumulating now around his thighs. He was exhausted. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The clock sounded like the rapid fire of a machine gun. The sand now reached halfway up the pedestal, burying the lower part from view. The cup was easily accessible, but untouchable because of the electric shield. Emily suddenly slumped onto the sand, yawning and holding her head tightly with both hands. "I wonder why there are 4 medals. That must mean something," Solomon asked. He lay down beside the pedestal, completely drained of energy. "In India, there's a story about time being divided into 4 ages," Raj said. "The 4 medals represent 4 stages of the earth as it goes from new to old." "That's nice, Raj," said Emily woozily as she laid herself flat on the sand. "I'm so tired. I think I'll just have a little rest." She closed her eyes and within seconds was asleep. Mei Ling had fallen to her knees beside Raj. Her face was flat and unresponsive. "I can hardly think straight, Raj." "What are you saying?" Mei Ling forced herself to focus on his voice, but her eyes were closing and her head fell sideways in exhaustion. "Mei Ling!" Raj yelled. Likewise, Solomon couldn't resist sleep. The sand was so soft it no longer felt like a threat. He laid his head on the sand to rest. As his eyes closed, he heard Raj yell, "Wake up, you guys! You need to stay awake so we can figure this out." Raj swayed. He was losing energy. He reached his hand down onto the sand for support. "I'm losing balance. I feel odd," he said to them, even though he was the only one still awake. The liquid was almost completely gone, the cup almost drained and empty. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Raj understood that the liquid draining from the cup was directly related to their loss of energy. "I have to stop it," he mumbled, turning to Mei Ling in the hope that she would spring awake with a solution. He looked more closely at the cup and saw the smallest crack in the iron base. He looked at the others. They were no help. His stomach felt queasy and his knees were weak. He was in danger of falling asleep. But he forced himself to take a deep breath and focus his thinking. "We have to get the liquid back into the cup," he thought. It was the only thing that was clear in his fuzzy mind. The air smelled funny. An odd combination of odors had filled the room, a mix of spray paint and burnt firecrackers. His vision was blurry and the air around him was streaked with metallic heat waves. He turned to look again at Mei Ling's slumped form and noticed a rectangular lump in the pocket of her mathlete's jacket. He remembered that she carried a juice box with her at all times in case of low blood sugar. He reached into her pocket, his hand shaking as he found the box, and ripped the straw away from the side. "It's so small," he thought, "but it might do the trick." He unfolded the accordion bends of the straw, stretching it to its full length. Tick-tock. The clock sound was now one uninterrupted beat. Raj sniffed in some sand and coughed, trying to spit it out of his mouth. He looked at his friends, whose bodies were almost completely covered with sand. Thankfully, their faces were clear of the sand and they were able to breathe, at least for a little while longer. Raj placed one end of the straw at the bottom of the goblet where the crack was. He held it there as firmly as he could without touching the goblet to avoid the electric shock. "Just in case you're right, Solomon," he said to himself. A cold sweat dripped down the back of his neck. He was starting to panic. He knew he couldn't get the liquid back in the cup with the straw, but somehow he didn't think that was the point. He just needed to make a connection between the bottom and the top, connect the end to the beginning. Then it would be okay. He reached the straw to the top of the cup, relieved that it reached. "Now, if I can just hold it," he thought, "at least the connection has been made." Tick-tock. His head fell to one side, and his arm drooped with the effort of holding the straw. It seemed ridiculous to expect the liquid to flow through the straw and back into the cup, but he didn't know what else to do. He felt his eyes closing. "Hold on," he told himself, "just another few minutes." Tick-tock. He waited as long as he could, but the liquid wasn't rising. His head fell forward onto his chest, too heavy to hold up. He quickly snapped it back. He was so tired. He held the straw as tightly as he could. The sand had reached his shoulders, a pillow awaiting his tired head. He laid his head back on the sand. Tick-tock. The last thing Raj saw before he closed his eyes was a small flash of light from the cup. Chapter 16. Time. The news of the tsunami flashed across every TV and computer screen in the school and in every home in the city, providing an endless parade of improbable images. There were houses sheared in half, boats resting on top of hotels, power lines broken like matchsticks, palm trees flattened like newly mown grass, and debris scattered across a bed of mud as far as the eye could see. There was no way to fully comprehend the destruction. The news reports could not begin to convey the horror of a wall of water smashing down on so many human heads. At the international school, many students had left early to take advantage of the extended weekend for Chinese New Year. Some of them had gone to the popular resort area south of Beijing that was hit by the tsunami. School was canceled for the rest of the day, and buses waited in the parking lot to rush students home. Tess sat with her head on Emily's shoulder in the back seat of the minivan. She clutched her school bag to her like a life jacket, opening and closing the zipper. "I'm really glad we didn't go on holiday to that place with the tsunami," she said, looking up at her big sister. "Dad wanted us to go there, remember? But then he got really busy at work." "Yeah," said Emily, "thank goodness." She put her arm around her sister's shoulder and pulled her close, breathing in the sweet freshness of her little girl's scent. Raj was in the front entrance, waiting for his chauffeur to arrive. He held his cell phone away from his ear, letting his mother's voice dissipate into the air. "You must come home straight away, Raj," she shrieked. Raj waited for her to finish, but she continued to sob in his ear. "Mommy, it's okay. It's happening south of us. We're fine here, really. Everything's fine. I don't care. I want you home." He could barely make out the words through her sobbing. "Mummy, Uncle has gone to meet the families from India who are coming for their loved ones. He will be gone for a few days, but Auntie and I are staying here. We are safe. We are fine." He knew from past experience that it was impossible to console his mother when she was worked up like this. "Raj, I am sending you a ticket to come home immediately," and she hung up. Solomon found Shane slumped in the locker room. "Shane?" Solomon was shocked to see tears flowing down his friend's usually cheerful face. "My parents were there." Shane's shoulders heaved up and down as he struggled to speak. "For holidays." His hands shook as he pushed them through his hair, trying to get it away from his sticky face. "They let me stay home so I could go to the snowboarding competition this weekend." "They were there?" Solomon looked at his friend in horror and reached out to put a steadying hand on Shane's shoulder. "Did you hear what they said?" Shane spluttered, saliva foaming at the edge of his mouth. "They said it would be like having an apartment building fall on your head. That much water." Shane looked up as he spoke, and Solomon's heart stopped when he saw the despair in his friend's eyes. "Oh my God, Shane." Solomon couldn't absorb his friend's reality. "Are you sure they were there? How do you know?" "I know." Shane was drowning in sadness. "The pictures on TV are the same as the ones my parents showed me from the balcony of their hotel. They were right there." His voice shuddered as he clasped Solomon's hand. The sky hung above the school like a fist ready to strike. Rain drummed down on the roof, a declaration of nature's anger. Students returned to school bleary-eyed after 2 sleep-deprived nights. Every day revealed new stories of friends or family members affected by the tsunami. Mr. Wilson, their history teacher, had been in the area for a jazz festival, and no one had heard from him. At the same time, there was a massive outpouring of support from around the world. Shipments of food, tents, beds, and housing supplies were being flown in, together with thousands of volunteers to help with reconstruction. It seemed as if people were reaching beyond borders and self-interest to help in a way that wasn't often seen. Solomon wondered if disasters served a greater purpose by getting people to pull together across the boundaries of race, religion, and nationality. Somehow it made him feel more hopeful. He texted the others in the morning, asking them to meet him in the cafeteria at lunch. The cafeteria was quiet, cloaked in the silence of shock. Solomon placed his tray on the table next to Emily. Raj and Mei Ling arrived and sat across from them. Emily looked at her noodle soup with disinterest. "This is connected to us somehow, I know it," she said, wringing her hands. "Does this mean that it's our fault if bad things keep happening?" Mei Ling's hands were shaking as she tried to open the plastic container of sushi. "We're only 15. We can't be responsible for all these lives." "Hang on, this isn't our fault. Tsunamis happen. It doesn't mean we're responsible," Raj said. "I think it's a freak coincidence that it happened now." His aunt had talked his mother into letting him stay to finish the school year, despite her fear of his imminent death. Education trumped disaster in this case. "Things are happening so fast all of a sudden," Emily said, squeezing her hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I thought we had more time," Solomon said. his voice heavy with worry. "It's about the cup," said Raj. Emily looked up from her drink. "So the secret is that we're running out of time?" "Well, you got the liquid back in the cup, right, Raj?" Solomon asked. "I'm not sure. I missed the punchline just like the rest of you sleepers," he said with a slight smile. He liked the thought that he had lasted the longest in the race against time. "It must mean something if we came back here." Emily looked hopefully at Mei Ling. "Raj, you said time was a cycle. What does that mean?" Mei Ling asked. "I don't know if I get it either," Raj said, trying to remember details from the book. "I think the liquid in the cup represents energy. The book said that when people and nature lose energy, things start to go downhill. Then we have to regenerate the energy to make it better." "Well, that helps explain why we were so tired in the hourglass," Mei Ling said. "So is that why you were trying to connect the bottom of the cup to the top to transfer energy?" Emily shook her head vigorously. "I don't get it. The assignment is about saving the world, isn't it? So why is it being destroyed? Did we do something wrong?" "The book was clear," Solomon said. "Annihilation never happens, but a massive cleanup is likely. Maybe there's a life cycle for the planet, and it's time for the Earth to be refreshed." He paused. "Dr. Matthews said we shouldn't celebrate Earth Day. He said we should celebrate People Day instead. He says the Earth will survive anything, even meteor collisions, massive earthquakes, but people won't. He says no species that destroys its own habitat can survive." "So you mean the planet isn't in danger, but people are?" Mei Ling asked. "Yeah, basically," Solomon said. "My dad used to say we can't avoid the consequences of our actions. That's what Buddhism teaches," Mei Ling offered. "Well, maybe the tsunami is one consequence of what we've done to nature in the past," said Emily. "Even though we're starting to change the way we treat the environment, maybe we still have to face the consequences of what we've already done." "The Cup of Life" section in the book said that when the human race has lost energy, it will be time to start again, said Raj, fidgeting with his silver ring. "The Law of Entropy says that everything starts new and gets old." Mei Ling was beginning to connect the dots between her love of science and what they were learning in the secrets. When power is lost, energy goes into chaos, and an outside source is needed to bring it back into order, like plugging the cell phone battery into the wall to recharge. "And if the end has to loop back to the beginning," said Solomon, "then what makes that happen? I mean, I get that it's time, but how do we get all the energy back?" "If we really believed we only had a short time left, I bet it would change our priorities," said Emily. "We wouldn't waste energy on things that don't matter." "Well, we could save a lot of energy if we stopped fighting about things," Solomon said. "Mr. Matthews says human energy is the most valuable renewable resource on the planet." "Well, everyone knows the environment's in crisis," said Emily, "but we're still arguing about carbon credits and quotas. That won't undo the damage that's already been done. Maybe the only solution is to start fresh." Suddenly, the lights in the cafeteria flickered and went out. The room was cast in semi-darkness, except for the natural light streaming in through the side windows. "Do you think that's Ravana's attempt to shut us down?" asked Mei Ling. "It seems like every time we get close to figuring out one of the secrets, something happens to stop us," said Emily. "We know Ravana is always nearby, but we have to keep going. Let's figure out what we know already," Solomon suggested. "Okay," said Mei Ling, looking at each of them. "We have 5 secrets." "All right, let's count," said Emily. "Secret number 1's the jewel of life," she began. "The soul that never dies." "Great. Okay. And the second secret's the feather of truth, or the law of karma," said Solomon. Mei Ling, Emily, and Raj looked at each other and shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They remained silent as Solomon waited for one of them to speak. Mei Ling broke the silence. "Solomon, remember in the book the second secret was the silent voice?" He nodded. "Well," she continued, "I heard the voice the night after the diamond field. And I had a dream," Emily continued, "about destruction. But it wasn't like a sci-fi movie, with the computer-generated effects. It was real, like what we have now, only more of it. Earthquakes, war, and lots of violence. She stopped for a moment, and tsunamis. The voice spoke to me in my dream. A quick look at Raja's face told Solomon that he was the only one who didn't know about the second secret. He felt his stomach coil and recoil on itself like a snake around the feeling of betrayal. The light suddenly came on again, and the fluorescent glare shrieked at him, "You have been wronged. They have betrayed you. They are not your friends after all." He felt the urge to lash out, to yell at them, and to shower them with hurtful words. He wanted to walk out of the cafeteria and not look back. He steadied himself, recognizing Ravana's influence and not trusting this uncomfortable surge of emotion. He stared at the glare reflected from Raja's ring and tried to settle his feelings. He remembered Ravana's threat to prevent their success just as they were getting close, and that she said she would find subtle ways to undermine their trust in one another. He turned slowly to look at Mei Ling, barely registering her nervous smile and twitching hands. Forcing his voice to remain calm, he said quietly, "Tell me about the voice."